I saw a story last night before I went to bed, and it came from the Heritage Foundation's Daily Signal, where it was referencing the new Attorney General Jeff Sessions. And Sessions is, well, it's nothing new. He's restoring the old approach to sentencing drug criminals, and returning us to the days of the '80s, and for a brief period during the terms of George W. Bush. Joining us in the studio this morning is Grant Loebs. He's the prosecuting attorney in Twin Falls County. First of all, welcome back.
Thanks, Bill.
That's
Nice to
got to
be here.
be you've mentioned this before, that one of the reasons crime has been down in the country is because we were locking criminals up. And then there's even in your own party there's a strain that says, well, maybe we should reduce sentences and move people along, but Jeff Sessions is taking a very different approach.
Yes, both during the campaign and now in policy, Trump and Sessions, especially Sessions, have made it clear that they intend to reverse some of the policies that the Obama administration put into place, especially with regard to drug crime. But also you saw Trump yesterday talking about speaking out in favor of policemen and making sure that the government is behind the police. So I think you have an about face here, but as you mentioned in your opening there, this is nothing new. What is new is the Obama administration's soft on crime strategy, which of course has backfired, and the Sessions memo goes back to what we had under Bush, what we had under Reagan, what we had under the first Bush, and you know to some degree, you have a back and forth on this because Clinton under Janet Reno kind of, went back, to went on the softer side, and then we got back to a stronger approach on, and this is again mainly on drug crime, but I think you'll see it across the board under George Bush, and then the most extreme statement of the um, yeah, I mean, these are all nuanced issues, but the most extreme statement of the softer on crime approach was made by Attorney General Holder under Obama. And so now this is getting a lot of press, but it's nothing more than setting things back before that.
He made some comments, and this is where, I think part of the reason that you've had people, some in your own party and Democrats, saying we need to relax things is because of it's expensive to enforce all of these crimes and keep people in prison. But during his speech, they have some figures that the Attorney General gave, and he said the murder rate has surged 10% nationwide, which is the largest increase in almost 50 years.
Mhm.
And he said, we know drugs and crime go hand in hand. And he went on to point out that 52,000 Americans died from a drug overdose 2 years ago. That's apparently the most recent
Right.
numbers we have. And so we could talk about the expense, but that
Well,
expense is keeping down. Can you put a price on life?
sure, that's exactly it. When you hear people talk about expense, you have to ask, what do you mean by that? What they often mean is that it costs a certain number of dollars to keep a person in prison for a day. And that's an expense, and that's an expense that we, associate with government. Government is the only, I think, the only legitimate group that can spend money on law enforcement. And, like national defense, that your government does those two things for sure. And so that is an expense and it costs money. The question, though, is if you don't spend that money, what happens? Is it just a freebie? Are we all fine? No money's being spent? And the fact is, no, money's being spent somewhere, either at the local level where county jails are absorbing it, like they do in Idaho, or at the personal level where you're absorbing the cost because your house got robbed, or because you got murdered, or because your son was addicted to drugs by a drug dealer. I mean, all of this stuff, you squeeze one place and it comes out somewhere else. It's not, you don't just say, ooh, there's money that we can save, let's not spend it anymore, and no bad repercussions. So, and that's, what Sessions was saying is basically what any prosecutor anywhere would say, and that is, if you find somebody violating the law, you charge them based on what you can prove, rather than some kind of overarching policy that says don't charge people who violate the law. If the Congress or the legislature in Idaho changes the law, then obviously we don't charge people with, crimes if they're not illegal. So when the laws are on the books, it's the job of prosecutors to look at the evidence and charge people for what they've done. And that's all Sessions said he is now ordering federal prosecutors to do.
Now, I read, I think it was at Wallet Hub yesterday. Uh, they were doing a rundown of states that have the most problems with drug, illegal drugs, and
Mhm.
also drug addictions. You know that Idaho is dead last. In other words, we're the best in the country, and I'd like to believe that that's because we haven't. Number one, we didn't do what Colorado did, or Oregon did, or Washington State did, and so there's still a pretty good approach to the old-fashioned way of enforcing these laws, and that may be why, if not that it doesn't exist here, but obviously there's a payoff in all of this.
Right, and Idaho's done some of these things too along the way, under the assumption that we should reduce the number of people who go to prison. And, we passed a couple of years the Justice Reinvestment Act, which was designed to look at people in prison and to release people, after their minimum terms who don't pose a threat. And there were some problems with that, and there were some fine tuning done by the legislature this last session to try to put that back on track and to try to make sure that some of the unintended negative consequences are reversed. But uh, you know, uh, as Sessions said, because there's also, a provision in his order that said, well, yeah, sure, a federal prosecutor who thinks that a particular sentence is too harsh for the particular activity can recommend a lesser crime or prosecute for a lesser crime if they believe it's justified. They just need to kind of clear it with us because he's trying to reverse the policy that said you don't prosecute people. So that is what prosecutors in Idaho do and across the nation do every day. I mean, we look at the charges, we look at the evidence, we look at the person, we try to find out whether they really are a threat, and if they are, they get treated more severely than if it's a first-time person who's engaged in a low-level crime. And that's the way I think people want it to be. But anytime you impose, rules that make it impossible for us to use our discretion to decide when, punishment uh, should be given and when it shouldn't, you have a problem, and that's what we had with the Holder decision. And also keep in mind, in Idaho courts, uh, the the decision about the sentencing on almost all cases goes to the judge ultimately. So the prosecutors are deciding on charges and making recommendations, and the judge does the sentencing, except in cases where there are mandatory minimums.
But the thing that I think confuses a lot of people, I remember being a teenager and watching Saturday Night Live, and John Belushi was this screaming character on set claiming that people had been locked up in Texas for having a marijuana seed since 1965. Ironically, he dies a few years later from a drug overdose. But there's always been this notion that we're grabbing people off the streets because they have a joint and sending them away for years and years and years in the deepest hole in the most faraway prison. That's never really happened.
No, well, it can't happen because it doesn't provide penalties which allow that. In Idaho, having a joint's a misdemeanor, and the federal government would never enforce a crime against a person possessing a marijuana cigarette.
Wouldn't have the
Yeah,
resources.
there aren't the resources, and that's another thing, of course, that you have to keep in mind when you're in law enforcement is where do you use your resources? What's the most effective use of your money and your manpower? And prosecuting people who have a joint, while it happens at the misdemeanor level, and it carries with it far lesser penalties than prison. There's nobody in prison because they had a joint.
I was going to
It's not a
say
prisonable offense.
it would have to be related to something else. And that's, I think, sometimes where people may lose sight of this because someone will say, well, my cousin got locked up, but your cousin may have been doing something else, and they just happen to find this on his possession as well.
Well, sure. If it's marijuana, in order to get locked up in prison, you have to have a larger amount. You can't just have a marijuana cigarette. So, but all these arguments are distorted. Maybe people would say on both sides, and it is incumbent upon individual people to try to sort that out. And sometimes it's tough. But right now you have a strange situation, and you mentioned it even in Idaho, where the people in favor of legalizing drugs or lessening the punishment for people who use illegal drugs and sell illegal drugs are on both ends of the spectrum. There's a group on the far right that's in favor of that, and then they link up with the ACLU, and it's a weird little marriage, but they're both lobbying the legislature for the same thing. And then there are people in what would be the broad mainstream of the political spectrum who have stood against it up until now.
I was going to point out that he also, the Attorney General mentioned that the strength of heroin that's now on the streets. I think I first heard of heroin when I was a little
Hmm.
boy and it was on a TV newscast. We had no idea what it was. But the strength of this now is like nothing that ever came
Yes.
before.
And that's true of a lot of drugs, heroin especially, and it gets most attention because it's more serious and often fatal on first use. And overdosing from heroin is a far more likely scenario than for methamphetamine, for instance. But also marijuana is, far, far more potent now than it used to be. You have a lot of middle-aged or older than middle-aged people who think back to, the 60s and 70s and think, they knew friends or they did it themselves and it's no big deal. Well, it's a much more powerful drug now than it was.
Governor Otter even has said that he talks to his colleagues, Governor Brown in Oregon and Governor I think it's Hickenlooper
Hmm.
in Colorado, and now they both regret that they've actually gone this far. Uh,
Well,
and,
it's out of control in those places and it's out of their hands.
and
And
in other words, they thought we'll just go with the flow here. Unfortunately, no one really put a lot of thought into the scientific research.
well, and Idaho hopefully can learn, whatever Idaho legislature decides, and it is up to them. And hopefully they can learn by a careful study of what happens in those states. If the Idaho legislature decides they want to move toward legalizing marijuana or making exceptions for medical marijuana or
Not in our
whatever,
lifetimes.
well, right, maybe, but if they decide so, they should do it in good time, meaning taking their time, and look at what happens in these states. There's no advantage to rushing to be the second guy to do something stupid. Wait till the first guy's stupidity is apparent, learn from that, and then you can make a better decision. And if in 5 or 10 years everything's great in Colorado and you go to Denver and that's the kind of city you want Boise to be, well, then great, do it. But we have an opportunity to learn from what happens in these places. I think that what's going to happen in those places and what's already happening is going to be something that Idaho does not want to duplicate. But time will tell.
We've got more on the way with prosecuting attorney Grant Loebs from Twin Falls County in just a couple of minutes. We're at 58. That'll sound really warm tomorrow. Trust me. 920 top story. Our studio guest is Grant Loebs. He's the county prosecutor in Twin Falls County, joining us this morning. Prosecuting attorney to be more formal. 923. And we're at 58. Bill Colley with you as well on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX at newsradio1310.com. A quick note, tomorrow's high temperature may be only in the mid 40s and we may see some snow showers at times, which means a lot of people are still going to be using that furnace, which has been getting quite a workout over the last several months. If you've got issues with your heating, and you've got to start thinking about the cooling system too, call the pros at Ramsey Heating and Electric. They'll come out and they'll get the job done right and get it done right the first time. Ramsey Heating and Electric is located at 2600 Overland Avenue in Burley, and they promise problem-free, cozy winters, and they also promise cool summers as well. The telephone number is 678-0459. That's 678-0459. We were talking, I think, a few weeks back about some of the problems we do have with heroin and meth throughout the region. There's a story coming out of the Capital District here in Idaho of a fellow who apparently was selling meth to a young man, and the young man died. I know meth is not necessarily always the direct cause of death. It could certainly contribute, but he's going to be prosecuted as the drug salesman. Now, this is not the first time this has happened, but it's not all that common, is it? He's being prosecuted for the
Well,
homicide, right?
that's under federal law.
Right.
And the federal law has a provision which actually a legislator this last year in the Idaho legislature tried to pass as an Idaho law, and it didn't go anywhere. That is allowing the prosecution of the person who provides the heroin that results in a death, or provides the meth or whatever that results in a death. So that was the prosecution. That was a federal prosecution, and uh, in Idaho, it would be possible but difficult to prosecute that under the current law. But it's also difficult to prosecute this even if you pass a law that says that it's against the law to sell methamphetamine to someone who then uses it and kills themselves, because you have to prove, and in this case, you had a confession plus a witness. Um, that is, the dead person's, I think, wife or girlfriend witnessed the delivery of this to the person who then consumed it and died. And then you had the person who pled guilty to this charge confess that they did it. And that's kind of where the problem is, in that you have to prove this. So if you're a drug dealer and you're selling drugs to people all over town, and I'm a drug user and I'm buying drugs from other drug dealers, we would have to prove to prosecute this kind of thing, that the drugs you sold are the drugs that I used to kill myself. And that's not going to be easy, um, because people use multiple sources. Uh, but in some cases, like in this one, where the guy confesses and somebody sees him deliver it and sees the guy use it and sees the guy die, it could be used.
I was thinking it's a little like that story coming out of Penn State where the fraternity brothers were doing the chug-a-lug game with the fraternity pledges, and one young man got so drunk he fell down a stairway and he ended up dying from his injuries. And they're going to be prosecuted, obviously, for this. And even though there's no obvious intent to do anybody harm, it was just plain stupidity.
Mhm.
But it's a similar type of idea.
Well, it's a little different because there's clearly a deliberate attempt to break the law by committing a felony in this case. You know, not stepping in to stop a kid who's drinking too much is, I think, a little bit different. But um, it's similar in that you are either providing something that causes the death, or you're not stopping somebody from doing something that would cause the death that is ultimately your fault. Um, but I think that the drug one's a little different because it's always a felony to be providing this in the first place. And if you're providing a substance that's a felony to provide and it kills somebody, I think that the logic behind this is pretty solid if you can prove it. And I think we shouldn't assume that if we pass a law like this in Idaho that we're going to have a whole bunch of prosecutions on it, because the times when we can prove it are not going to be frequent.
We have a caller with us. And caller, you're up next. You're on the air with prosecuting attorney Grant Loebs at 927 on KLIX.
Yeah, good morning. I apologize for calling back again, Bill, but I want to get on this subject. Um, isn't there a way, asking the prosecutor, to, in the penalties, to have it like in DUIs where a wreck and somebody was killed, or this drug stuff, where the person that's selling it or getting caught taking it can be made to go watch the coroner when they do the autopsy? Because, see, death anymore has been so watered down with several reasons, whether it be the abortion issues, whatever. But death doesn't mean what it used to mean to the society in general. Isn't there a way to put it in the law that you kill somebody in an accident, DUI, or selling them drugs, you're going to watch an autopsy. You're going to see what really happens when somebody dies from this stuff.
Well, the answer is, of course, the legislature could pass a law that says that that is a punishment that can be used, or an educational program that can be imposed upon a defendant. Um, Judges have the authority in probation sentences to make those kinds of provisions. I mean, a judge could put somebody, a DUI person, for instance, on probation, and they often go on probation. And as a term of probation, they could say you have to go to, DUI class, and you have to go to AA meetings, and you have to go to watch an autopsy. I mean, they could list that as a term if they wanted to, because probation requirements are essentially contracts that the defendant, after conviction, agrees to in order to stay out of jail or prison. So that can be done, and there have been cases where those kinds of things are ordered. I don't remember any locally where watching an autopsy has been ordered, but take a class uh, in the effects of DUIs. That happens, and you see crashes and wrecks, and you hear victims talk.
We've got more coming up with Prosecutor Grant Loebs in just a couple of minutes. Thanks for the call. It's 9:30, and it's 58. Our guest is Twin Falls County Prosecuting Attorney Grant Loebs. It's coming up on 9:34, and we're at 58. Bill Colley with you as well on Top Story on News Radio 1310, KLIX, and newsradio1310.com. And the telephone number to reach the show is 736-0300. I was just commenting somewhat tongue-in-cheek off air. I mentioned that I emailed my sister the other day and said there must be a two-tier driving system that if you don't have any common sense when you take your test, you have to wear signs on the back and front of your car that read UTAH. But then I was commenting to the prosecutor that when I went to Utah the other day, I made a note that Idaho drivers near Brigham City and south were the ones who actually were, I thought, the most problematic. And maybe people, when they get out of their home territory, behave differently on the highway. So we perceive Utah drivers to be a little cavalier, and yet on the other hand, maybe when we get out of state, we're just as bad.
Could be, and these wide open spaces on these roads out in the west encourage people to go faster, and the speed limit keeps going up, so you know everybody takes the speed limit as it is and adds another two or three at best, and
They don't have the two tier though, where we have the 70 for truck traffic and the 80 for passenger cars. They have just a straight 80. It
in
seems,
Utah.
at least in
Yeah.
northern Utah, until you start getting into the burbs, and then all of a sudden it drops to 75 and then 70 for everybody though. And maybe they get impatient waiting behind trucks on our roads.
Could be, I don't know.
We have a caller with us, and again, the telephone number 736-0300. Caller, you're up next, and you're on the air.
Hey, good morning. Yeah, talking about the driving, this has been about 3 times now. I've had pickup trucks or whatever. I'll be doing the speed limit, and they'll go in the bar ditch on the right-hand side to go around me, doing 70 miles an hour in the 35. And you call the police, and, you never see a policeman. They say that they don't have enough police there. Maybe they need to get some more.
Yeah, that's really dangerous. I mean, passing on the right is bad in the best of circumstances, and it's allowed only if you're passing a car that's slowing and turning left, then you can pass somebody on the right, but not at 70 and not in a 30-mile-an-hour zone. That would possibly even qualify as reckless driving, which would be a misdemeanor, which is not merely just a ticket, but a trip to court and possible jail time. Um, but you're right, of course, and the police are right. They can't be everywhere, and they don't have enough people to respond to everything. If you get the license and you can testify about it, you can call the police and tell them that you want to be a witness and testify. But you would have to know who was driving too. You have to prove who's driving, not just what car it was.
Thank him for the call, but you probably have witnessed something like this story. I was talking to a lawyer in a rural county in upstate New York about 20 years ago, and he represented a lot of people from out of state or from big cities. When they would pass through on the interstate, they would get pulled over for speeding. And they used to tell him, but there's nothing out here. That was always their excuse.
Yeah.
There's nothing out here. And so they, in their minds, it's like, who am I hurting if I'm going 15 miles over the limit? You probably see
Well,
that in your office.
And that may be true in a factual case if there is in fact nobody out there. But this gentleman says he's driving the speed limit and somebody passes him on the right
Mhm.
and goes into the ditch to do so at 70 miles an hour. That's a difference. You know, uh, it's kind of like the tree falls in the woods. If nobody's there, does it make a sound? I mean, if you're driving 10 miles an hour over the speed limit on a deserted country road and you
Mhm.
don't see anybody, it's not legal, but you're not actually hurting anybody. But this call um, is the kind of thing that can hurt people.
A waitress at a restaurant in Hollister told me last week that it's not uncommon to look out the window at Route 93, though, and see people going 100 miles per hour And that stretch of road obviously is well patrolled. I give credit to law enforcement there, but it again, it seems people come over the mountain ranges. I don't know if it's that they're in a
You're
hurry
talking
or
about on the way to Sun Valley, or
jackpot,
oh,
actually.
on the way down to Jackpot. Yeah.
Right.
Well, that's a dangerous road because it's heavily traveled, and it's two lane. There are passing lanes, and that has changed over the years, and they've added those and made it safer, I think. But that's a dangerous road because a lot of people have been drinking too, and a lot of people go down and come back late at night. And then the road north to Sun Valley is kind of dangerous as well, because it's a two-lane road almost the whole way,
And it's not as
and
straight.
it's not as straight. And so those two-lane state highways are more likely to be a danger than the interstate.
We've got more coming up with prosecuting attorney Grant Loebs in just a couple of minutes. We're approaching 9:40 and it's 58. Also, if you've got a comment or question for the prosecutor while he's in studio, he's here until 10 o'clock. Telephone number is 736-0300. That's 736-0300. We'll take those calls on the other side of the break as well. And also, I've got a question for him myself about some proposed changes in laws in Utah where it's almost as if law enforcement decided they were going to nullify it. That might not be the proper word, but it had some sway with people when they were having a discussion about changing the limit for DUI. Our studio guest is prosecuting attorney Grant Loebs from Twin Falls County. Bill Colley with you as well. We've got about 15 minutes to go. We're at 9:42 and 58 right now. That may be roughly our high for the day. Just a quick note, tomorrow we're looking at even some potential snow flurries at times, at least early in the day and maybe late in the day, highs only in the 40s. And remember, weather is a service of Mountain Home Auto Ranch in Mountain Home. Telephone number to reach our program today, 736-0300, 736-0300. We were talking about Utah in the last segment. There had been some discussion among legislators there about lowering the legal limit for DUI to .05. And I had read last week where there were objections from, of all people, law enforcers who thought that this was going to be a little bit too much. There are some people out there who would say, don't drink and drive at all. Also, the restaurant industry thought that it was of course, they want to sell you a beverage, an adult beverage, but they were worried that it would have a severe impact on their business. Do you think that perhaps sometimes we go overboard with some of these rules?
Well, to my knowledge, that didn't pass. But DUI is a very serious problem. We have filed more DUI cases in Twin Falls County in the last 12 months than we have over the years in any 12-month period that I can think of. And that's with the fairly recently lowered level from .10 to .08. And I think that if you're a legislator and if you're a person making public policy, you look at the deaths and you look at how dangerous this is and you try to stop it. And
Mm-hmm.
I think the '05 suggestion is an attempt by the people that were pursuing that to try to stop that. At some point, though, I think if drinking alcohol is going to be legal, and if you're going to allow people to drive at all after they've consumed alcohol, you get to the point where you lower it so much that it really makes any kind of drinking and driving illegal. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I mean, drinking and driving is not a smart thing to do. Um, these laws, as I mentioned to you just before the break ended, these laws are an attempt to enforce common sense at a level that is higher. It's more extreme than most people's brains tell them to stop drinking and driving. And most people out there who are drinkers will not get behind the wheel at a .07 because they know that .08 is the level and they can drink right up to an '07. Because at an '07, you're going to feel like you shouldn't be driving. And if you allow your common sense to dictate to you what to do, you won't be anywhere near the legal limit. But at some point, you get to the point where you go out with your wife, and your wife is a smaller person, and you're a bigger person, and you both have two beers, and then you leave. She might very well, being a smaller person who weighs less, be over the limit with two beers at an '05. Um, I think maybe borderline. Maybe it would take 2.5 beers, but it all depends on your metabolism. But these laws are an attempt by legislators to try to stem the tide of death and destruction that's caused by DUI, and I think that a lot of them would rather err on the side of being more severe than have this kind of thing happening on their freeways.
We have a caller with us. Caller, you're up next. It's 9:45. You're on the air.
Well, I'm a little bit late coming to the show, but I appreciate you taking my call. Um, how is the local prosecutors on the local level affected by the Department of Justice call for harsher prosecution?
That's a good question, and the answer is not directly. On cases that we handle, not directly, but there are often times when somebody, especially on drug cases, is kind of falls in between jurisdictions, either in terms of the severity of the crime or the type of crime. And we are partners with the U.S. attorneys and with the federal law enforcement people. And there are times when a case is taken over by the federal government, and we have a say in that. It could be either a state case or a federal case. And in times when the federal government is, as Sessions said, enforcing the law and charging people with what they need to be charged with, that is quite a bit of help to local jurisdictions. In times when the federal government announces a policy of leniency, then that puts a lot more strain on local law enforcement because there isn't an option to call the feds and have them help out. But in other than that, the only really real effect is kind of psychological, and it has a psychological effect, I think, on local and state lawmakers when the federal government is either moving toward one extreme or the other.
Want to thank him for the call. When we were chatting about legal limits for drinking, I know that when I lived in New York, there was a two-tiered system. They didn't call it DUI; they call it DWI. It's just a terminology is a little different.
Mhm.
You were .10, and then it dropped eventually, I think, to .08. You were DWI, but if you only had a point between .05 and .08, you had a second tier, which was driving while impaired,
Yeah.
not necessarily under the influence. So it was a lesser
A
charge,
lesser charge with lesser penalties.
but it was really the warning charge that they
Mhm.
could get you on and hope that that was a deterrent. It seems, though, when you reference the number that we've seen in the last 12 months, sometimes it seems that you have a deterrence and it works well, maybe even for decades. And then there's almost a fatigue that comes along and people start violating that. It's a little bit like dress codes. People will adhere to it and then and maybe after a couple of years, they'll start cheating on the dress code at the office, seeing if they
Maybe.
can get away with
It's
it.
hard to know why it is, and each case is individual, but the rate's been going up. Uh, Not coincidentally, I think, and back to our discussion at the beginning of the program about drugs. You know, uh, since January of this year, my office has had two of the highest number of felony charges filed months in the 25 years I've been here, and we broke a record from many years before in January, and then we broke that record again in April. So there are crimes across the board are up locally, and I think probably in the state. And if you look at what the Attorney General said nationwide, a good share of those are drug crimes, but all kinds of things are up. DUIs are, as I said, up, and other crimes are up too, to the point where we had a record-breaking month in April, and that's a scary trend.
Every time I turn a corner, it seems anywhere around here, though, there's some construction going on, and we're seeing such a boom, business boom, and population boom. Uh, you wonder if a lot of the newcomers are just thinking, well, this is the Wild West. I can do anything I like, and maybe don't realize, and maybe the mores are different. They're coming here, and there's more drug use and more drinking and driving from people. And I'm not trying to point the finger at saying it's retirees from
Yeah.
California, but
Well, it's all kinds of things. It's population growth. It's the fact that we are a corridor for drug dealers to use to get to Boise, to get to Sun Valley, coming up from the south. Um, and that brings with it all kinds of other problems, because as we all know, when drug crime goes up, other crime goes up, and when drug use goes up, other crime goes up. So, um, and the not the bulk of, but certainly about 50% of the charges that we filed in April were drug crimes. So that shows how large a percentage of the crime is drug crime, and much of the other is related to the drug crime.
If you look around the state, and I guess we're now one of the more urbanized counties, but you don't have to go far away. You go to Jerome County or go up to Camas County. These places, they don't have anywhere near the resources because of the small populations that we have. And in some places, they have federal land, so they don't have the tax bases as well. And I'm sure that enforcement, prosecution, I mean, all of these things are going to be strained with all of these changes, cultural changes. And then we've had the ongoing argument over the last couple of years since I've been here about public defenders, and because a lot of these small counties just simply don't have the budgets to handle all of that.
That's true, and of course they make up for that to some degree by having a smaller population and therefore smaller demand. But if you're a small county and you're in the way and you're on the road to somewhere, you're going to get probably more crime than you deserve and perhaps more than you can afford. And with the state public defender issue continuing, you will be, for at least that part of your law enforcement budget, you'll be required by outside forces to spend money which you don't have. Um, you know, you, individual counties make decisions about individual prosecutors' offices and salaries and the number of people, and same with police departments and sheriff's departments. But with the public defender thing, the difference there is you have a statewide um, group that is going to be telling you um, there's a statewide standard and you're falling below it, and they're going to impose one of the many unfunded mandates that the state legislature imposes on counties. There is a provision with regard to that, though, that allows counties to access a fund to help them with that. Whether it will be enough money to help them with that, we'll wait and see. I don't know.
We have another caller with us. Caller, you're up next. You're on the air at 9:53 with Prosecutor Grant Loebs.
Hello, yeah, I don't know if I got bad information, but I've heard that you can prosecute somebody for the same crime federally and with the state, and it doesn't kick in double jeopardy. And if that's true, how does that affect the way you might prosecute?
Well, you can't prosecute them for the same crime, but you can, under some circumstances, prosecute them for what is essentially the same act under different offenses. For instance, you can commit a murder at the state level, be prosecuted for that, and you can be prosecuted for a civil rights violation at the federal level for taking somebody's life. You still can't be prosecuted for the same exact crime because that violates the double jeopardy provision in the Constitution. But there are tests to determine. If you were to complain, hey, I'm being prosecuted for the same crime as I already was prosecuted for, that's a violation of the Constitution. Then the judge would have to look at some of these tests to determine whether that's happening. And if there are different things that you have to prove the second crime that you didn't have to prove the first crime, then you usually can be prosecuted for similar or even sometimes the same act under different statutes.
I want to thank you for the call. And it reminds me, too, that sometimes there's some negotiation that goes on between federal and state here in the sense that you try to figure out who might better get a prosecution. And if it's a particular heinous crime, you want the toughest sentence. So in federal court, it might be tougher than, let's say, state court or vice versa.
That's true, and it's back and forth. You have to have a discussion between the two attorneys, the U.S. attorney and the county prosecutor, to determine which which system best fits the facts that you have. Because there are a lot of considerations, not just who has the most severe punishment, but that's one of them. And in some instances, the state crime carries more punishment than the federal crime. and in some instances it's the other way. But also you look at, is this something that, the state wants to prosecute, to make a point and to be the prosecuting entity that's closest to the people? Is this something that we understand better than they do because this guy's committed 5 other crimes in our county and our judge knows who it is, and our prosecutors and our police and our people know that this crime happened here. So there are all kinds of things that go into that rather than just who has the most severe sentence. But there is a lot of cooperation if a case is potentially a federal case.
We have about 2 minutes. Caller, you've got to make it quick. Go ahead. You're on the air.
Thank you. We had a problem a few years ago, and we had a robbery on our business, and there was a woman that called us from your office, Mr. Loeb, that said that she was a victim's advocate and told us that we would have our reimbursement of all the damages before that man was out of jail, and that never happened. So how does the probation officers look upon those reimbursements?
Well, that's a little bit more complex than maybe I have in 2 minutes, but I'll give that a try. The judge orders restitution in cases where there is damage to individual citizens, and that I'm sure is what my person was talking about. The judge will order that be paid. That amount then is assessed to the defendant. And if they go on probation, there is a program set up by the probation office where they pay a certain amount a month, depending upon how large the damage is. They would then be monitored by the State Department of Probation to make sure that they make that payment. If they fail to make that payment, sometimes the only person that knows that is the probation officer or the victim. If they fail to make that payment, the victim can call my office and we can maybe file a probation violation for failing to make restitution. They should not be allowed to get off probation without having paid that restitution. And sometimes the probation will be extended because they haven't made the payments yet. It is certainly true that in some cases they get off probation without paying the full amount of restitution. And we need to rely on the victims themselves to help us know when that's happening so that we can file paperwork before they get off probation to make them pay that.
And I want to thank you for the call. We're leaving some people hanging today, so lots of people are trying to chime in here near the end of the program. If they'd like to get a question answered, if it's a complex one, maybe they can call your office.
Sure, especially the last caller. If there's still an outstanding issue, call and we'll see if we can help them out with that. It might be too late if they're already off probation, but if they're still on probation, we can help with that.
All right. We'll see you at least in a month, if not sooner.
Okay.
And wanted to point out, too, as well, Rush Limbaugh's program is up next, following the news at 10 o'clock from Fox. Bill Colley with you, and hopefully I'm back here tomorrow morning. God willing, the creek don't rise. That's the plan. And we'll wish you a great day otherwise.
The creeks are rising.